Inclusion and exclusion criteria. All studies that provided 1. Quantitative estimates of discretionary and non-discretionary sources of salt, or 2. Information about the various food groups contributing to dietary salt intake were included. For intervention studies, only baseline data on dietary salt sources were included. Exclusion criteria included studies in pregnant women, those investigating the amount of salt consumed by a population without quantification of the dietary sources, and commentaries on and opinions. Articles were not excluded because of age, sex, study design, sample size, sampling methodology, or geographical location. Titles and abstracts of retrieved articles were evaluated by one investigator, in brackets SB, Sierra Bravo, who was not blinded to authors, institutions, or manuscript journals. If an abstract did not provide adequate information about inclusion and exclusion criteria, the full text was evaluated to determine study eligibility. Sounds pretty extensive, but let's see. Data extraction. Titles and abstracts identified in the initial search of 5,542 were screened, and studies that did not meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria were excluded. It's 5,409. Full texts of the remaining studies, 133, were obtained and screened again based on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. An electronic data extraction form was used to extract relevant data from the remaining included studies, 74 peer-reviewed and 6 grey literature sources. Figure 1, which we will see as we scroll down. Key data extracted included the following: geographical location of the study, years of data collection, method of dietary salt assessment, sample size, average age, percentage of dietary salt obtained from discretionary versus non-discretionary sources, and contribution of different food groups to dietary salt intake. Discretionary salt intake was defined as salt added to food during preparation at home or at the table. Full text screening and data extraction were performed by 2 investigators, SB and MM. So that's Sierra Bravo and Mike, with any disagreements resolved by discussion to reach consensus. So this is figure 1, is it? Yes. Flow diagram for the screening and inclusion of publications in the systematic review that investigated the sources of dietary salt. Is there any way? Open image in new tab that we can look at this more closely. Here it is. Let's see if we can zoom. There we go. 5,542 studies identified, 2,449 were from Medline, 971 were from Global Health, 696 were from Sinal Plus, 661 were from Scopus, 604 from Lilacs, 119 MBase, 41 bibliographies, and 1 from the World Health Organization. 5,268 studies were excluded, 5,183 titles violated inclusion criteria, and 85 of them were duplicates. 274 studies screened by reviewing abstracts. Of them, 141 studies violated inclusion criteria. So 131 studies reviewed in full. 4 of them were duplicates. 55 studies violated inclusion criteria. 6 grey literature sources identified from bibliographic review, and 80 studies were included in the end out of those 5,542 studies that were identified. Okay, so that's that. Now, the following major food groups were included in our data extraction as they were commonly reported across studies and were major contributors to salt intake: bread and bakery products, beverages, non-alcoholic, cereal and grain products, confectionery, convenience foods, dairy, eggs, meat and meat alternatives, oils and oil emulsions, sauces, dressings, spreads and dips, seafood and seafood products, snack foods, sugars, honey and related products, vegetables, fruits, nuts and legumes, and other. In instances where reported sources of salt overlapped with more than 2 categories listed above, or in instances where discrete categories could not be delineated, the values were reported under the category that likely contributed most to the daily salt intake, based on similar studies available in that country. For example, if a study reported that 30% of daily salt was obtained from bread and bakery products and cereal and grain products combined, and if other studies from that country showed that bread and bakery products contributed to daily salt intake more than cereal and grain products, then this 30% contribution to daily salt intake was reported under the bread and bakery products category. If sodium intake, milligrams per day, was reported, it was converted to salt grams per day by dividing by 1,000 and multiplying by 2.54, the ratio of the molecular weight of sodium chloride, 58.44, to the molecular weight of sodium, 23. Study quality assessment. The quality of each study was assessed by 3 parameters: relevance, representativeness, and risk of bias. Relevance was ascertained by how recently the data were collected, and studies fit into one of 4 categories: within the past 5 years, between 5 and 10 years ago, between 10 and 15 years ago, and more than 15 years ago. Relevance to the modern context was deemed to be an appropriate index of quality given the rapid nutrition transition occurring in many developing nations that is associated with changes in dietary patterns and therefore sources of dietary salt. The representativeness, and hence generalizability, of the data in each study was judged to fit into one of 5 categories: probably representative of the national population, probably representative of a subnational population, probably representative of urban regions, probably representative of rural regions, and probably not representative. In this classification scheme, subnationally representative implies characteristic of a state or region within a country. To determine the risk of bias, we adapted a tool for cross-sectional studies developed by Hoy and colleagues, and scored the studies as having low, moderate, or high risk of bias. The tool evaluated each study's methodology by assessing, among other things, sampling technique and internal validity. Studies with scores of 0 to 2 were judged as having a low risk of bias, 3 to 5 as having a moderate risk of bias, and 6 to 7 as having a high risk of bias. Data analysis. Given the large variability in methodologies and the heterogeneity of populations studied within a country, no meta-analysis was performed to obtain pooled estimates across studies. Exploratory linear regression analysis was conducted to assess whether the level of discretionary salt intake is related to the level of economic development between countries, assessed by the annual gross domestic product, that is GDP, per capita. For this analysis, as well as for determining the discretionary salt intake and sources of salt in a country, if multiple estimates from different studies were available for a country, one study was chosen according to the following hierarchy. 1. The study was representative of the national population. 2. The study had the most recent available data. And 3. The study had the lowest risk of bias. For instance, if no nationally representative data were available for a country, then the study with the most recent available data was chosen. The GDP data for each country were obtained from the World Bank website. And there it is there for anyone to click on. For the year of data collection. Data are presented as means plus SDs unless stated otherwise. World maps were created using Excel, Microsoft 2018. All statistical analyses were performed in Prism 6, GraphPad Software Inc. 2015. Results. Study characteristics. The 80 included studies 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, all the way through to 101, were conducted between 1975 and 2018 and represented 34 countries across 6 continents. I wonder what happens if I click on one of these. No, it doesn't take me. To study. I wonder if I would have to actually be registered with this website for it to click on, like go to something, hyperlink to something that I need to read. Um, anyway. 44 studies, that's 55%, collected data on dietary salt sources within the past 10 years. 33 studies, that's 41%, had data of more than 10 years old. And 3 studies, 4%, did not provide information about when data were collected. Only 32, that's 40% of studies, were judged to be nationally representative, whereas close to half of all studies, it's about 38, which is 48%, were deemed to be non-representative of any particular population groups. While most studies were conducted in adults aged over 18 years, that's about that's 40, which is 50%. Some were conducted exclusively in children and adolescents. So that's 12 of the studies, which is 15%, and generally included both males and females, 48 of them, which is about 56%. The sample size ranged from as few as 20 individuals to more than 1 million. The majority of studies had low, 32 or 40%, or moderate, 43, that is 54% risk of bias, with only 3 studies, 3.8%, having a high risk of bias. Table 1 is a summary of the quality assessment metrics for included studies investigating the sources of dietary salt across the globe. I would say world, not globe. So that's what this is. In the last 5 years, nothing collected in Africa, that's an entire continent. 5 in Asia, 3 in Europe, 2 North America, none in Oceania, or whatever, how do you pronounce that? And 1 in South America. Okay, so yeah, 11 in the last 5 years, 33 5 to 10 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago, 13, more than 15 years ago, 18, 3 missing. In total, we've got 78. Okay. The number of studies in each continent belonging to each quality metric is shown. 2 studies reported data from more than one country and are not included in this table. Discretionary salt intake. 33 studies provided an estimate of discretionary salt intake, supplemental table 3. The average daily salt intake of adults in these studies ranged from 5.2 to 15.5 grams per day. The percentage of discretionary salt intake classified into 3 categories: low, less than 25%, medium, 25 to 50%, and high, more than 50%, is shown in Figure 2. And detailed quantitative estimates are provided in Supplemental Table 3. Populations in Brazil, China, Costa Rica, Guatemala, India, Japan, Mozambique, Romania, and possibly Benin appear to obtain more than half of their daily salt during cooking or at the table. Populations in Jordan, Portugal, South Korea, Taiwan, and Turkey appear to receive between 25 and 50% of their daily salt from discretionary sources. On the other hand, discretionary salt intake in Australia, Austria, Canada, Denmark, Finland, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America accounts for less than 25% of daily salt intake. Okay, so less than 25% is in the West, the English speaking world. So you've got Australia, New Zealand, you've got North America, Canada, you've got the UK there, and that's Finland there. Okay. So South America and India, Asia, consuming a lot more salt than is supposedly recommended. Figure 2. Contribution of discretionary sources to dietary salt into the world. Green, less than 25% of dietary salt. Yes, we've gone over that. That's just the key to what we've just looked at. Exploratory analysis of discretionary salt intake as a function of economic development. An inverse correlation was observed between the GDP per capita of a country and the proportion of daily salt intake from discretionary sources, such that for every $10,000 GDP per capita, the proportion of daily salt obtained from discretionary sources was lower by approximately 8.7%. That's 95% CI, 5.1% to 12%. Figure 3, which is this that we're looking at, which is tiny. So, oh no, I've just clicked Save Image as I didn't want to do that. Open image in new tab. Let's look at this a bit more closely if we can. Alright. Because it's getting this too much in detail, because I want to continue reading the rest of the article. So screenshot that if you want to look at that. I should go back to reading. So, discretionary salt intake, which is a percentage of total salt intake as a function of per capita GDP. Per capita GDP figures expressed in constant 2010 US dollars were obtained for the year when data were collected for each study. A statistically significant linear regression fit, solid line, was found. F equals 25.3, P less than 0.0001, with an R2 of 0.55 and slope equal to minus 0.00087, in brackets 95% CI, minus 0.0012, minus 0.00051. The 95% CI of the regression line is depicted by the dashed lines. GDP, gross domestic product. Sources of salt. The proportion of dietary salt from food groups across countries and studies is provided in Supplemental Table 4 and depicted in Supplemental Figure 1. Individual food groups contributing to daily salt intake in countries for which data were available are shown in more detail in Supplemental Figure 2. Some food groups, including bread and bakery products, cereals and grains, meat products and dairy products, were found to be significant salt intake across multiple countries and continents. In many European countries and the USA, the proportion of daily salt from bread or bakery products ranged from 25 to 40%. Cereals and grains contributed up to 24% of daily salt intake, with highest levels noted in China and Brazil. Meat products provided up to 31% of daily salt in the USA. Meat also provided a substantial source of daily salt in some European and South American countries, and in Australia and New Zealand, range 4 to 16%. Dairy products accounted for up to 15% of daily salt intake in Argentina and New Zealand, and between 1 and 13% in other countries. A significant proportion of salt, 44%, came from sauces and dressings in Japan, a finding unique within the countries with data available for this analysis. Discussion. In this systematic review, found that countries had data on dietary salt intake patterns, and of these, only 24 had data on discretionary salt intake. The proportion of salt entering the diet from discretionary sources varied substantially between countries and continents. We identified countries where discretionary salt represents a large proportion of overall daily salt intake, including Brazil, China, Costa Rica, Guatemala, India, Japan, Mozambique, and Romania. Exploratory analysis suggests a strong inverse relation between the proportion of salt obtained from discretionary sources and a country's per capita GDP. While there were no obvious regional patterns in the food sources of dietary salt, bread and bakery products, cereal and grain products, meat products, and dairy products appeared to be the main global contributors to daily salt. Key strengths of the study include its comprehensive search strategy, the large number of studies identified and included, the diversity of countries represented, and the overall low or moderate risk of bias of the included studies. This study builds on the systematic review by Menyanu et al. That reported the contribution of selected food categories to daily salt intake in 7 low and middle income countries. In addition to providing a more up-to-date review on the topic, our study extends the findings of Menyanu et al. By including globally available data encompassing a greater number of countries, quantifying the proportion of dietary salt from discretionary versus non-discretionary sources, identifying individual dietary categories contributing to daily salt intake, and assessing the quality of the available data. Effective population-level salt reduction is likely to require implementation of multifaceted strategies tailored to a local context. Salt reduction policies exist on a spectrum from interventions targeted at individuals, such as diet and education campaigns, to structural approaches such as product reformulation and salt substitution, regulations, taxation. Our results, by providing a comprehensive and up-to-date map of current evidence related to the dietary sources of salt, highlight gaps in the data and may also aid policymakers to direct limited resources toward the predominant dietary salt source in a given setting. Food reformulation policies and efforts have been consistently targeted towards bread, meat, dairy, sauces and dressings, and convenience foods in many countries, an approach supported by our findings. Furthermore, increasing the availability of salt substitutes or reducing their costs is likely to be appropriate in countries where discretionary salt intake is high to facilitate the use of these products in daily cooking. Our finding identified a specific set of countries with a high discretionary salt intake where more widespread use of salt substitutes may be prioritized. Additional research in these countries should also further evaluate the potential of salt substitutes to lower blood pressure. Our exploratory analysis suggested an association between a country's economic development and the discretionary salt intake of its population, possibly capturing the effect of nutrition transition on changing salt consumption behaviors. Most of the urban middle-class population in India, for example, have more access to a variety of convenience foods, including processed, ready-to-eat foods, as they undergo a rapid epidemiologic, demographic, and nutrition transition. Our findings highlight the potential to use a country's per capita GDP to impute its population's discretionary salt intake, although such an approach will require validation in a larger data set. Several limitations of the study should be noted. Many countries lacked recent studies, and those that collected data more than 10 years ago may have limited relevance to the modern context. This is important given the rapid nutrition transitions, changing lifestyles and dietary trends, and implementation of new and updated food policy initiatives. The majority of the identified studies assess salt consumption among nationally representative samples. While this might be viewed as reducing the generalized of finding at first glance, from a policy and intervention perspective, it might be more important to understand sources of supply, for example, North versus South India. The results from the preliminary association analysis with the country's GDP should be interpreted cautiously given the potential for ecologic bias. There could be confounding factors such as varying methodologies, for example, dietary recall, lithium labeling, demographic characteristics, of the population studied between countries. Another limitation of the present study is the substantial variation on how different investigators categorized various foods, making it difficult to directly compare food categories within and between countries. The lack of readily available demographic data for studies and variable representativeness of the population studied, we were unable to perform secondary analyses of salt intakes for subpopulations within each country. Finally, some recent reports have challenged the world view of more major health organizations and governments of the health benefits of salt reduction. Our study does not attempt to address this ongoing controversy. Rather, it was conducted to identify key sources of dietary salt across the world to help guide the design and implementation of salt reduction policies. Our study was based on the premise that population salt reduction interventions are possible and likely to reduce hypertension and cardiovascular disease burden. A number of research recommendations emerge from this review. More studies are needed that incorporate nationally representative populations. Research also aimed to deploy more consistent methods, for instance, related to dietary survey methods and categorization of foods, to provide a more harmonized view of the landscape of salt consumption across the world. While low and middle-income countries suffer the highest prevalence, our findings suggest that data related to dietary sources of salt are particularly lacking in these countries, which should be urgently addressed in future. Evidence has identified specific neurons in the control of salt appetite regulation. These findings indicate the need for additional investigations to assess the relative influence of endogenous, is that how you pronounce that? And the external food environment on salt consumption behavior, which will determine the likelihood of success of policies targeting the reduction of salt intake. This is the first systematic review investigating the sources of dietary salt. This study identified countries where more than half of the daily salt intake comes from salt added during cooking or at the table, including Brazil, China, Costa Rica, Guatemala, India, Japan, Mozambique, and Romania. Globally, bread and bakery products, cereal and grain products, meat and dairy products appear to be the main content of daily salt intake. Key food groups that should be targeted for salt reformulation efforts. So at this point, I have to say that, all right, bread and bakery products are grains that have been ground down, okay? But they're basically foods that are whole foods. They come from plants that grow in the ground, the eggs that might go into them, the butter that might go into them, that's animals, somewhat from the ground, right? And so that's mentioned in the meat and the dairy product as well. Cereal and grain products, again, they come from the ground. So they should have a natural amount of salt in them. And this then that they represent key food groups that should be targeted for salt reformulation effects. So they're basically whole foods of the natural amount of salt that they should have in them. Those foods weren't supposed to have that amount of food in them. They wouldn't have them in them. And have them in them, and those amount of salt is bad for us, which it's only argued, I've not seen any hard evidence to support that claim. It's just a theory thus far. The amount of salt is bad for us, then it should just be that we should. I mean, there's a lot wrong with eating bread and bakery products because they refined carbohydrates, right? And they go into our blood a lot quicker for they spike carbohydrate levels, which spikes our insulin resistance. Okay, and when we're storing what could be nutrition as fat instead of burning it off as energy, right? So yeah, we shouldn't be eating that anyway. Cereals and grain products, yeah, they are high carb. They have the same kind of impact. Meat and dairy products, I know if we're not eating the refined carbs and the grains and cereals, maybe then we're not going to be taking in too much salt so that we can get away with eating the meat and dairy products. Because the meat, the animals, actually can consume all of those high carb products and take all of the nutrition from them and put that into their flesh and excrete all of the toxins and the sugars and all that comes from those carbohydrates. So I can't help but wonder, what are they up to? Represent key food groups that should be targeted for salt reformulation efforts. What's this salt reformulation efforts? What are they going to try to do to meat and dairy products? Right? Heard about trying to get meat off the market, try to stop having cows because they fart and all the rest of it, which they've been doing since they first arrived on this planet, right? And it's actually instrumental in plant growth, carbon dioxide. If we didn't have carbon dioxide, there would be alive, right? The more carbon dioxide we have, the greener the planet becomes. That's it, that's been suggested here. Anyway, let's finish this off. It says acknowledgements. The author's responsibilities were as follows. SB and MM conducted the research. SB analyzed the data and had primary responsibility for final content. SB, MM, and JHW drafted the manuscript and provided critical review and feedback for the manuscript, contributed to the research design, and read and approved the final manuscript. And that, my dears, is about as far as I can go for today, and is the end of that article anyway. So the other article that I wanted to go to, I can't. I don't have time for it. But yeah, that was a lot to read. That was a lot to get through, a lot to process. Hello, Graham in the chat. Anyone else who might have turned up? Yeah, there's something very, very shady about it. Like, they're doing these studies, and then what they're doing with that information, they're not saying, oh, we should inform about what we've found. It's how do we change populations? How do we manipulate people into changing how much salt they consume, even though it's not conclusive whether salt intake is good or bad for your blood pressure levels. Like, they're still wanting to press ahead with modifying our behaviors, which in Intel circles is known as mind control.
Smooth moderator. Smooth moderator. Smooth moderator.